check. 1 2 1 2. It's the Y2K Collector. Happy Monday. Hopefully you had a great weekend. Mine was jam-packed with a bunch of fun stuff, but I'm going to save that for another video. This morning, I wanted to talk about an article that I think is really important to those who are major proponents of emulation, who like to emulate and are choosing emulation over actual physical collecting. At this point, most types of emulation, if not all emulation, is illegal, right? If you're emulating games, if you're using ROMs, if you're using computer systems or pieces of software that allow you to play legacy games, really any game that was made before 2010, 9.99 times out of 10 you're doing it illegally. Now there was a bill, I guess, or a proposition that was presented to the U.S. Copyright Office that was made in an effort to allow the digital preservation of basically retro video games or older video games. And the reasoning behind it was for research purposes. Gaming historians wanted to be able to access these games for the purposes of research in the future without basically getting in trouble for copyright infringement. And so what this bill was meant to do, or what this proposition was meant to do, was to allow legal access, or really legal emulation of these video games. And it turns out video game publishers are not down with that. And so at this point, based on what was received from the US Copyright Office, physical preservation is going to be really the only legal way for you to access and play a lot of these retro games, because there has not been any type of legal exception made, whether it's for research or not. And this article is very, very interesting. It comes from Game Radar, and it says publishers are absolutely terrified. Preserved video games would be used for recreational purposes. So the U.S. Copyright Office has struck down a major effort for game preservation. And this is an article by Dustin Bailey, came out on Friday, I think, 3 days ago. So it says, this fails the needs of citizens in favor of a weak sauce argument from the industry, and it's really disappointing. So it says, a 3-year fight to help support game preservation has come to a sad end today. The U.S. Copyright Office has denied a request for a DMCA exemption that would allow libraries to remotely share digital access to preserved video games. It says, quote, for the past 3 years, the Video Game History Foundation has been supporting the Software Preservation Network on a petition to allow libraries and archives to remotely share digital access to out-of-print video games in their collections. VGHF explains in its statement, quote, under the current anti-circumvention rules in section 1201 of the DMCA, libraries and archives are unable to break copy protection on games in order to make them remotely accessible to researchers, end quote. So essentially, this exemption would open up the possibility of a digital library where historians and researchers could check out, quote unquote, digital games that run through emulators. The VGHF argues that around 87% of all video games released in the US before 2010 are now out of print. And the only legal way to access those games now is through the occasionally exorbitant prices and often failing hardware that defines the retro gaming market. So basically, the Video Game History Foundation is basically arguing, they're wanting this access. They want to create this digital library that's shared for research purposes. And a lot of these companies, video game publishers, they're basically saying, no, we don't want to allow this. And I can understand it on both sides. I don't know how many people would be like, would there be a segment of the population that would be trying to play these games for research purposes, like strictly research? Sure. But I'm sure that there would be a ton of other people who would just use the library to just play games in general. They just would want to play games, and it would cause them probably to sell off a lot of their their hardware, and they would just use the library because here we have this free library. We can use it for research. We can play video games. We no longer need these games, right? But the argument that the VGHF is making is they're saying, well, hey, listen, the only way we can play these games, 87% of which are no longer being printed since 2010, only way we can get access to these games is by diving into the extremely expensive retro gaming market. And this is a huge part of the reason why a lot of those who promote physical collecting, this is the reason why, because those in power and those who have power to or control over this software, they're going to deny as much as they can any type of free range access to these video games in an emulation format. So like I've always said, I'm not necessarily against emulation. It's just, it's not, obviously it's illegal. You're infringing on copyrights, but you save yourself hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. The article goes on, it says, still the U.S. Copyright Office has said no. The Register concludes that proponents did not show that removing the single user limitation for preserved computer programs or permitting off-premises access to video games are likely to be non-infringing, according to the final ruling. Quote, she also notes that the greater risk of market harm with removing the video game exemptions premises limitation given the market for legacy video games. So I'm going to read that again. She says, quote, she also notes the greater risk of market harm with removing the video game exemptions premises limitation, given the market for legacy video games. So basically, they're saying, well, look, we're not going to permit this because there's a huge risk here. Based on how the retro gaming market looks right now, which it's universally recognized that the retro gaming market is on fire. It's hotter. I don't want to say that it's hotter than it's ever been, but it's definitely gotten a lot of attention. People have been very much into retro video games. I would say just as much as new games. People are going backwards because that's where a lot of the nostalgia is. That's where a lot of the originality is. That's where a lot of the fun is. And they're basically saying, look, given the retro gaming market or given the market for legacy video games, this is a big risk. It poses a big risk to a lot of publishers. So the article continues, that ruling cites the belief of Entertainment Software Association and other industry lobby groups that, quote, there would be a significant risk that preserved video games would be used for recreational purposes, end quote. We cannot, of course, entertain the notion that researchers enjoy their subjects for even a moment. More importantly, this also ignores the fact that libraries already lend out digital versions of more traditional media like books and movies to everyday people for what can only be described as recreational purposes. Members of the VGHF, sorry, bear with me one moment. So it says, members of the VGHF are naturally unhappy with the decision. Quote, unfortunately, lobbying efforts by rights holder groups continue to hold back progress, end quote. The group says in its statement, noting the ESA's absolutist position that would not support a similar sort of copyright reform under any circumstances. Quote, I'm proud of the work we and the other orgs we partnered with did to try and change copyright law, VGHF founder and director Frank Cifadelli says on Twitter. Quote, we really gave it our all. I can't see what else we could have done. This fails the needs of citizens in favor of a weak sauce argument from the industry, and it's really disappointing. And so, it just goes to show that there are organizations, the Video Game History Foundation, and probably a number of other organizations that are making this behind the scenes fight to create these open access digital libraries where researchers, we'll call them researchers for right now, but researchers can go in and access these games for research purposes, because there will be a day not far from now where a lot of these games will, some of them will belong in museums because it will be so old. Video games as a whole is still fairly new as compared to other historical, interests. Like when you compare video games to sports has been around way longer than video games, right? But as time passes, when you think in 2040, A game that came out in 1980 will be 40 years old, and 2040 is not that far away, right? That's only, what, 15 years from now? And I'm saying only 15, like 15 years isn't a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, you know, games are getting older and older. And the desire for people to want to preserve these games are going to grow quickly. And I'm realizing, I kind of knew it in the back of my mind, but I'm realizing it more when I read this article, only because while video games are still relatively new when you compare them to other hobbies like sports and other things like that, the window for video games is much shorter because we're able to digitize this hobby way faster than sports. And when I say digitize, meaning we're able to remove the physical aspect of video games way faster than really almost any other recreational activity. And companies are in the process of doing that right now. A lot of their consoles that are coming out are going to be coming out with digital versions only. The removal of physical media is quickly approaching, and 10 to 15 years from now, we may not, everything may be legacy, you know. 15 years from now, everything video game wise might be legacy that's physical, because there may just come a point where the entire industry says, that's it, no more physical from now on. We're not even making consoles anymore. We're going to give you a fob. And it may come to that. Pretty soon it may come to a point where all you get, the latest system, everything you need is put on some type of fob, and you plug the fob into your HDMI port, or maybe by that point they'll have 4K ports or 8K ports, who knows. Maybe there's a VR port, and your entire system would be placed into this little fob, and that's how you access all your video games. And we'll be looking at the PlayStation 5 like an ancient relic because of how big it is and how clunky it is, and it's got this external disk drive, and everything looks so ancient and antiquated, and pretty soon it's all gonna look antiquated. It's all gonna look antiquated. And I think this is the reason for companies, or organizations rather, like the VGHF for wanting to set a precedent from now before everything goes all digital. They're trying to establish a precedent that allows citizens, the public, to have access to these games that have already reached legacy status, and the games that will soon reach legacy status, so that we can continue to explore, you know, how this hobby has evolved, where it originated, and some of the games that have spawned generations of entertainment for children to come, and adults as well. But let me know your thoughts on this. It's really interesting, very, very interesting. I didn't know that there was a behind the scenes fight to create this legal emulation. I think it's very interesting. I'm interested to know your thoughts. That does it for this morning. It's the Y2K Collector. Hopefully you had a great weekend, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take it easy.